Now, being vulnerable and experiencing it as vulnerable to me are two different things, right? In other words, you joke about, being penis owners. I exist with this physiological manifestation that is incredibly vulnerable, right? And yet very resilient. And at the same time, there's my inner experience, which didn't feel very vulnerable. But again, it may have, if I didn't have the access that I had. In other words, I had friends that I could solicit information from who could connect me with the medical community.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosopher. Welcome back to Season 4 of The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we explore life, sex, and modern relationships with some of the world's wisest erotic philosophers. My name is Cindy Darnell. I'm a sexologist, sex and relationships therapist, and coach, and of course, I'm the host of The Erotic Philosopher. I am also the author of Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. You can find out more about me at my website, cindydarnell.com. But before we jump into today's interview, I want to tell you about a new project I'm working on. It's my online subscription community where you can learn more about the issues that we tackle here on The Erotic Philosopher, be they relational, personal, emotional, sexual, and beyond. So many of us need support and help and scaffolding, making sense of our complicated lives and relationships these days. So this new online community serves as a portal to learn more from me and from others as we dive into the issues most important in creating meaningful lives and fulfilling sex. You'll find out more about this online community on my website, Cindy Darnell, under the Community tab. Today's guest is a return from Season 3, my dear friend Eric Schneider, a sex, couples, and relationship therapist with a keen interest in working with, exploring issues especially relevant to men. In today's episode, however, Eric shares his very personal story about surviving prostate cancer and its effect on his personal life, including his intimate partner relationship and their sex life. This episode is not about titillation, but to flag the importance of men discussing these issues in public, to normalize the aloneness so many men feel when their sexual performance is impacted by aging, illness, or trauma. Eric's story is shared as just one example of how prostate cancer affects our lives, but also for men experiencing struggles with unreliable erections, changing bodies, and the value of community, connection, communication, and partnership. I hope you find this conversation helpful as a place to begin your own inquiry into how to make relationships stronger by learning more about the power of presence to transform the quality of our relationship. Welcome back, Eric, to The Erotic Philosopher. It's lovely to have you back. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back.
And so we've decided that our discussion today is going to take a profoundly intimate turn. And the reason that I invited you back was because you've had this incredible experience spanning several years that I think is such a valuable conversation for all of us to have, particularly men, particularly penis havers, particularly people who have lived through and are continuing to live with the effects of prostate cancer, which has been your experience. So I don't want to talk for you about this, Eric. So I'd like to invite you to sort of start at the beginning. And how was it for you when you first had your diagnosis? How did that land for you? And how did that impact you and your partner?
Big question. The first thing that comes up was, even before the diagnosis, there was a sense of something not being right, sort of just an intuitive hit of something. I was having the enlarged prostate that comes with aging, and my joke for my stand-up routine when I was doing stand-up was, I'm at that age where you make the decision between 8 glasses of water or 8 hours of sleep at night. But that was not the issue that kind of drove me to check. My PSA had gone up a little bit, but still not in that range where questions would start to happen. But following the intuition, I found someone who would give me a biopsy, and sure enough, they discovered cancer. I was very fortunate in the clumsy handling of the diagnosis, in that I got an email with the pathology report and no other information. So instead of having a reaction to the pathology report, I had a reaction to how I got the pathology report.
Right.
I was enraged, and actually, fortunately, I have some really good friends who could interpret it. We figured it out. But that rage carried me into the doctor's office to.
Was that a system error, or was it just sheer lack of duty of care on their part?
I think for them, it was a complete lack of knowing which hand was doing what in their office. But that rage was very helpful because it helped me focus on that. And then I got the information I needed. Fortunately, I'm very fortunate and blessed in that I have friends who are physicians, lots of access to information. Another good friend of mine had recently had prostate cancer, who is also in the healthcare area of my life. So I got a lot of feedback very quickly. My particular diagnosis was sort of medium moving, right? So with medium moving as opposed to fast moving or slow moving, the recommendation at that time was surveillance. The weird juxtaposition for me of a cancer diagnosis with my internal experience is you have a cancer, what does that mean? Never really landed on me in that way because my internal experience was so different. I wasn't experiencing cancer. I was experiencing actually other people's ideas of what cancer mean in terms of how they related to me. With all sorts of weird kinds of comments, because I was also very public about it and transparent about it, because like why we're doing this is often it's not talked about, especially with men. It's often goes underground. It's not something people are free and easy. Well, men or penis owners, as you might say, are not very comfortable talking about it. So I was very public about it. And the response I got was, on the one hand, warm and caring and loving and supportive. On the other hand, it ranged from various forms of advice giving, attribution of causality, from diet to psychological, out of a Louise Hay book from the 1980s. I heard it all. But actually the diagnosis was not very meaningful to me in terms of my experience. It was very disjointed in a way. My body was my body. It was doing what it was doing. I had this diagnosis. There were no aches or pains associated with it. So the word itself didn't land very hard on me.
So you had this sense, which is what inspired you to go and have the test. So you're like, something's not quite right down there. Then the test comes through as affirmative of cancer. And then everybody's saying, you need to do this. It's because of that. It's, blah, blah, blah. Probably trying to be helpful. And, you obviously, in the capacity that I know you as a dear friend, I know you have a strong personality, and you can also tell people where to step off when they've pushed it too far, which is a very good quality. And I'm curious then about once it.
Well, actually, I want to pause for a moment. That's
Sure.
Actually very important.
Okay.
Because people are trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
And they're not.
Right.
Right. And I think that for a lot of people that, like you said, I don't have a lot of people telling them, to to step off, as you kindly put it. It's not, it wasn't the word I had in mind. But I remember.
Kindly step off.
Yes.
Probably more like kindly fuck off quickly,
Yeah, not even
actually.
kindly. I was, to go back to that, I had scheduled a trip to Bali to visit one of my advisors at that time, Gil Hurt. And I was out with a friend of mine who lives in Bali. And, we went to a restaurant and I ordered a Diet Coke. And he looked at the Diet Coke like it was the culprit of my cancer. He says, well, you may want to think about your diet. And I'm like, I didn't ask for your advice. I didn't ask for your feedback. But I mean, that is an important part of the process. In other words, what I code as supportive versus what other people think they're doing that they think are supportive without consent, which is a very interesting thing, right? We talk as sex therapists, we talk about consent all the time, but we don't actually think about consent in more intimate conversations. And actually that's actually an important thing. As someone who is going through that process, there is a bunch of others involved, friends, family, etc. And that capacity to tell people, as you would say, to step off, it's really important. It's not something to be overlooked for any kind of issue that you have.
Yeah, I mean, that's the unsolicited advice giving is very rarely lands well. And then particularly when somebody is vulnerable to, having received the diagnosis. And I mean, years ago, a very dear friend of mine in Australia had a brain cancer diagnosis, and she ended up dying. It was a very severe form. But in the early days of her diagnosis, again, it was the same thing. People were like, it's the mobile phone. It's the, she'd smoked cigarettes. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is severe, but I understand people, I mean, they think they're helping, but it's not helpful. Showing empathy and support comes in various forms, and telling people that cancer is their fault is never helpful.
I was very public about it, and being very public about it, people make comments and share things, and often, again, without consent and without, and as you said, yes, I'm quite capable of telling people to step off. But I think that's an important aspect of my process. In other words, you framed it as a vulnerable, specifically vulnerable time. I didn't necessarily experience it as a vulnerable time. It was imposed upon me in a way that it was a vulnerable time. And this may have a lot to do with my history. I started my work as a therapist at Manhattan Center for Living and Friends Indeed for almost 17 years, where all we did was death and dying, grief and loss. So I didn't necessarily experience it. I came from the, why me, why not me school of Steve Levine, but I was like.
And so for folks listening who may not be familiar with that, what you're talking about the HIV era.
The AIDS crisis, right. And so, and that changed over time. Of course, we branched out and we're dealing with cancer and whatnot. But so I didn't necessarily experience it as a vulnerable time. Part of that is my history. I think another part of that was the incredible access I had. I had access to information. The part of it that was troubling for me was that there was a lot of other things going on in my life at that time. My mother's health decline, I'm trying to remember the dates. There was a lot going on in my life for like a 7-year period where a lot of different things were happening. A relationship was ending. I was in graduate school. I was changing graduate schools. I was moving, all those top stressors. And so I was experiencing depression. Despite the depression, I was able to, maintain my diet and continue to work out and continue to work. But but there was a very strong decrease in my energy, which actually was testosterone related.
And was that related to the cancer, or was that a separate thing that just was sort of happening?
Separate thing. I always had issues with low testosterone, and the research on testosterone, high, low, cancer, prostate cancer, it's all over the map. So nobody really knows. So I couldn't actually, right? So I inquired about other options, antidepressants, and even did a small bout with one. Didn't find it was very helpful, and managed to process whatever was going on with it, and move past it. The physiological depression, not the same as psychological depression. So, there may not be anything to process necessarily. And I was very much in touch with my anger and my frustrations.
And I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up about physiological depression in contrast with psychological depression. I think a lot of people think about the impact on our health and well-being, on our relationships, even on our sex life as depression being about a psychological thing. But I know also from myself, when I have experienced it, which has not been a lot, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a depressive person, but I have had periods of it. And it has hit me much more somatically than psychologically. So I think that that's a really powerful distinction. I've not actually heard anybody talk about it like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you go on WebMD and you look up any, anything, depression, physical depression, depression brought on by changes in physiology, they exist. And, often, low libido or all of those things may not be psychologically induced. They can actually have physiological and, neurochemical issues that need to be addressed. And so, even though we may skew on the air of the psychological, they're interrelated. So they're interconnected. So there's, that's something that almost seems like a no-brainer. But I mean, I got a lot of feedback like, oh my God, you must feel like your body's betraying you. Must I?
It's interesting. Again, I mean, the language that people use along with the unsolicited advice is like even I know, I did it myself to you and saying that it's a vulnerable time. And you're like, I didn't experience it. I didn't. Right?
I didn't.
So that's my story that I'm putting on it. And, so for people listening, this is not to say that you're an asshole if you do this. We all do this.
No, we all do.
Even
that.
As skilled professionals.
Absolutely.
I still did it just
That's
then,
right.
But it's about being able to recognize that it's happening, being able to talk about it like you and I are talking about it, and for you to say, no, that's not how I experience it, and not for me to keep pushing the point and saying, well, yes, you are vulnerable, actually. Of course, I know more about your condition than you do.
Now, being vulnerable and experiencing it as vulnerable to me are two different things. Right. In other words, I am, you joke about, being penis owners, I exist with this physiological manifestation that is incredibly vulnerable. Right. And yet very resilient. And at the same time, there's my inner experience, which didn't feel very vulnerable. But again, it may have, if I didn't have the access that I had. In other words, I had friends that I could solicit information from who could connect me with, all of the, as anyone who's ever tried to navigate the medical community in New York City, it can be challenging. And, but fortunately for me, the medical situation was frustrating enough to keep me quite occupied and very connected to assertive and aggressive energy, and move forward. So I was diagnosed, it was August 19th, 2021, when I had the surgery. 5 years prior, I was diagnosed. And so I was put on surveillance, which meant watching and checking PSAs. And so that's what I did, while I was struggling with the hyperplasia of the prostate, the enlargement of the prostate, which, it's the peeing issue at night and the lack of sleep that's actually the worst part of that. and given that now it's interesting, the prostate is also mostly smooth muscle. So it makes me wonder about how that happens and why that happens so predominantly with men on such a regular basis. There are those that don't suffer from it, but it's a different question.
Let's fast forward now to, so you've had the surgery. It
Right.
went well, insofar as that you're still here on the planet.
We can talk about
die.
that process. We could talk about that process because I think that's the process that was the most, there were challenges to that process. One of the challenges, being a gay man, one of the challenges, right, even with a place like NYU, they ask you to fill out these questionnaires every time you come. And they're sexual. One of them is a sexual function dysfunction kind of questionnaire, and it's entirely heteronormative. So it's about insertive practice only. And even before the surgery, I was having some intermittent. Tumescence was not as full as it once was, and bladder pressure made it uncomfortable. So
and just I want to pause for a second, just a language thing for people listening who might not know the word tumescence is a medical term for erection. So
right. So but bladder pressure and discomfort as a consequence of frequent urination and challenges with that, part of me that was actually looking forward to being relieved of all of that.
So I'm curious, say more about that. Say more about this relieved from what? What would it make possible for you to not have that pressure?
Well, my bladder would void itself completely rather than these partial issues and
I see. Okay.
So that was one of the, I was on things like Flomax and things, and none of it really helped all that much. And so I was looking forward to the relief of that. And at the same time, it's a big surgery. And that was challenging. My insurance changed, so my surgeon changed, and I got a nice young narcissistic guy who was exactly what I wanted. Someone whose ego was completely involved with the benefits of this surgery, and he did a very good job. It was a very strange experience to walk into the operating room and to see the robotic machines. They looked like something out of Star Wars or Star Trek, but. And then I woke up and all the aftermath of the surgery, the recovery was very present for me. That was really the hardest part. The way, I don't know, well, the way they go in is they cut holes in your abdomen, like 4 or 5 holes in your abdomen and above your belly button, below your belly button. And basically they're moving the internal organs up. They're disconnecting the bladder from the prostate, right? And everything has to be resituated and resutured and all the rest.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. I thought they would go in up the bum, but they don't. They go in through the front.
They go in through the front. So post-surgery. So he had told me that 50% of the nerves were spared on one side, 80% of the nerves were spared on the other.
What does that mean?
Well,
I know what it means, but what does it mean for you?
So the nerves for tumescence are different than the nerves for orgasm. And so, and they were telling me a year and a half to 2 years for full recovery. That's a long time. And my mind went back to all the other testing that was involved, all the nuclear testing, all the CAT scans, right? Because they're checking whether it's all in the cancer is within the capsule of the prostate. So a lot of medical kinds of activities in medical time, which seems to function in an entirely different time zone than our everyday lives. Like I said, the medical system provided a lot of fodder for me to maintain frustration and aggravation and irritation and anger and focus.
So that's really a theme here in this experience for you, is this anger and frustration, which, I imagine that a lot of that has to do with the American medical system being really subpar in contrast with many other places in the world. So that coupled with your emotional state, the physiological depression state, is it's a lot to carry.
Yes, and also good fuel.
fuel for
going,
keeping going.
keeping it going,
Okay.
following through, keeping it going, and paying attention to what was happening to me physically. Post-surgery was the most difficult. Although I was in, I would say, good spirits, my body was really sore and very unsettled internally, which is not something I'm particularly used to, right? So that was the hard part. And of course, being touched and, all of those kinds of things, even being jostled a little bit was very, very uncomfortable.
Almost like your psychic body is extra sensitive, that any kind of what normally would just be contact felt really jarring. And
absolutely. And post-surgery at the hospital was amazing. I was in the same wing that my mother passed away in, which was this incredibly
that's powerful.
It was very powerful. And it was incredibly, on another day, we'll talk about that experience, because that was the most beautiful way to go anyone could go. They took incredible care of my mother, as an aside. And they took incredible care of me. I had never seen a TV that big.
That's a good marker of care.
It was like, really, seriously, the view, the whole thing felt very, very, and everybody was very nice and very caring, which is my general experience at NYU once you're actually doing something there. But then we managed to get home, which was also, a cab ride, of course, across town, which had its own challenges. But my partner really was the one who made all of this as comfortable and as supportive and as nurturing as possible. His patience and his kindness and his gentleness and his support is really what made this possible. Had I been alone, it would have been a very different story. It took about 3 months for my body to kind of settle down. And what I mean by that is sort of what we were alluding to earlier, which was like kind of just that soreness to start to really go away. The Kegel exercises, because now when the prostate is present for men, it's like an automatic garage door. It closes and retains urine involuntarily. But without that, it's all voluntary, right? So the plumbing issues were challenging. And part of that is sort of the nerve damage. It's like I can't quite feel urine the same way in the urethra, in the penis itself. That had to come back so that the control, I could be more aware, and all of that kind of stuff. So that process was slow going. The tumescence issue, they were like out of sight, out of mind once I wasn't there. And I was asking about it. And I had been on Cialis 5 milligrams on a daily basis. And then eventually, because it was like, okay, this isn't working out too well. Now, interestingly enough, while I couldn't get erect, could still have an orgasm. Of course, without the prostate, there's no ejaculate, right? But I was able to still have an orgasm. So, certainly didn't stop us from engaging sexually. Just altered what we were able to engage in.
So can I pause you there? Because I think this is a really powerful piece of the conversation as well. How did you allow for that discussion to start being present? Was it something that you two discussed about altering your activities? Or did it just sort of happen? You just did. Okay.
Yeah. We are very fortunate in that we're very good at both in all sorts of ways, not just sort of the direct, explicit conversation, but with communication in general. So, what I'm very good about saying that stop, I don't like, yes, more, I'm the red light, green light thing works really well for us.
Right. And then obviously shifting into activities that don't put a lot of pressure on you physiologically, that don't demand erections of you, and also are not going to look like traditional sex.
Well, many of them would look like it, but they just didn't actually function the same way, And for me, I can't say that sex ever just centered around my penis, but the physicality moving, being more energetic, and all of that. The dial was toned way down. And it was a discovery process for both of us to find out what we liked, what worked, what made us feel good, what engaged us, in terms of pleasure. But no, it's not like we sat down one day and had a pancake breakfast and said, okay, let's talk about, sex at this point. It was very exploratory and a great deal of experimentation.
So is that a very somatic approach rather than a verbal approach?
Yeah, it was, it was a very kinesthetic, somatic approach, experimentation, trying out different things. At one point, and I kept pressing them to help out with the erections, NYU, the hospital. And finally, one of the PAs got in touch with me, says, oh, there's a shot we can give you. So there's a shot that you can give yourself prior to sex, which will vasodilate and create erections, which I got, which means you have to give yourself a shot every time.
And so you inject into the
penis itself.
Right. Okay.
Right. And that worked too well, to the point where the erection wouldn't go away. So I had to go to the hospital and get my penis drained.
Oy.
And I didn't know actually how much blood a penis could contain. That was a big surprise for both of us. We were kind of shocked.
And when you say drain, like not that they were drawing it out like with a blood work exam, it was just they were rerouting the blood to somewhere else, or they were pulling it out of your body.
Pulling it out of my penis directly, right.
Goodness gracious.
Right? And then they give you a shot of something else to kind of counteract that. So that was at one point we both looked at the thing and said, we're not doing that anymore. It's done. The Cialis currently helps. Use is important because the more you use it, the more you're actually helping the nerves to regenerate and to do what they can.
And the neurological aspect of it, rerouting the signals between the brain and the body to say, we can still do this. It may feel different than before, but that the connections are still there, that sort of neural firing of it not just being a thing that you think about, but from the body sending the messages back up to the brain saying, we can do this. And so you're saying that the injection is, obviously a good idea. And maybe for folks listening, they might think, oh, I didn't even know about it. I certainly didn't know about it. But the side effects sound so severe that to be that committed to having an erection, to go to that degree every single time sounds like a lot. And I think, it also comes back to this story about men and erections and the significance of erections for men, particularly around sex.
Yeah. I mean, I've my situation is, prostate cancer in men, we can sort of generalize to a certain degree, but not everybody winds up with the same functionality or dysfunctionality that I did. It varies in degrees. Sometimes it's a lot worse. Sometimes it's a lot better. Clearly we could have managed the dosage and reduced that, and continued that way, but it really wasn't worth it as far as either one of us was concerned.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of The Erotic Philosopher as much as I enjoy bringing it to you. I love being able to introduce these guests from around the world to you, and in return, it would help me enormously if you would go to Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts and leave The Erotic Philosopher a rating and review. Your labor there helps this podcast land in front of people's eyes and ears, and what better way to help create a more inclusive and supportive world than spreading more information to more people, and you'd be doing a great favor to me too. If you would like to find out more about working with me, head over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, where you'll see my offerings as a therapist or coach for a streamlined and personalized service, plus my online pleasure school under the online courses tab, where you'll find a suite of pre-recorded classes ready to go. There's something there for everyone. You'll also find my online community under the community tab, where you can join me and others just like you navigate the topics we discuss here on The Erotic Philosopher and so much more. There's no shame in needing support to better understand these complex parts of our lives, and I am here to support you every step of the way. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at The Erotic Philos. That's PHILOS. You can also follow me on social media. I am at Cindy, CYNDI_DARNELL on Instagram, TikTok, and on Twitter. Thanks for joining us here today, and now let's get back to the episode. I'd like to kind of move another pivot here to talk about, you're saying that your partner, part of this transition was made much more graceful because of his kindness and generosity. And so the impact on your relationship, so it's one thing to have an impact on your sex life where you're doing the exercises and you're taking the medications and trusting on some level that the body is going to heal itself to a degree and that you're going to start to be able to experience eroticism in a different way than previously, but it's going to be there and it's just going to take the time. So I'm curious now about the impact of this on the quality of your relationship. How has it impacted the relationship? What's been challenging and what are the surprising benefits of it?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have
Thank you. It's a therapy question.
Yeah. I can't say a lot's changed, and I can say a lot's changed. It's kind of like both of those things at the same time. Part of the trajectory for me was with the plumbing issues, right? That's where I got not so much about the erectile issues, but the lack of bladder control was really where the self-consciousness was, and also the discomfort on my abdomen, right? So that had to be kind of managed and regulated in a way that didn't permit me to be as free and as comfortable as I wanted to be. And yet, regardless of my discomfort, even my discomfort was welcome. It wasn't, I didn't, he's not one to say huff and puff, and he's not one to say, nothing really disturbs him in that department. So there was a lot of potential freedom for me to partake of. Like I said, had I been single and as a gay male, I might have thought differently about this.
How do you think it would have been different?
Well, in other words, right, if I'm a single gay man and I'm on the apps, this becomes something I would be making explicit. The intermittent functionality of my erections. The fact that I have to manage some incontinence. This would have to be made explicit, which would require a degree of information giving that within that context nobody really wants to actually talk about. Right. We're having this conversation. Breast cancer has been something that people have been talking about for decades. Women have been upfront about it, supportive about it, encouraging about it, speaking about it. Prostate cancer is like a secret. And within gay culture, as a gay man, that could have been a different kind of navigation or negotiation. Like I said, I've been very, very fortunate. There's no question in my mind about that. From the medical access that I have to a partner who is, thinks I'm a hot guy, continues to think I'm a hot guy.
You are a hot guy.
Thank you. And can't wait to be touching me in some way, whether it's affectionate touching or sexual touching. So context would make a big difference in how I would think about this and experience this and feel about this. So while a lot has changed, I've become more comfortable. I'm more relaxed in my body. These things don't trouble me the same way that the self-consciousness about them is not present at this point. There's an ease and flow in my body that's returning, but it's still returning. It's not quite there yet. Wherever there is, there's still little bits of pains, and sometimes I can almost feel a kind of a band around my abdomen, and I don't know what the hell they did in there, but it doesn't quite feel the same as it used to in that sense. So there's still some discomfort, and I'm particularly sensitive to these things. I admit that up front. I mean, even my doctor was like, I don't know what the hell you were experiencing, but right on to whatever you were experiencing, because it led to the diagnosis and then potentially all the treatments, etc. So I'm a little odd about these things. Medications I'm very sensitive to medications, and so these things, the way I experience myself in my own skin are still present, but not in the same way they were early on. But like I said, because of my partner's sort of love of me, appreciation of my looks, his desire for me, it didn't seem like anything fazed him. And I know he had to make adaptations and adjustments, and I know that there were frustrations that he experienced. Those we talked about so that he could understand a little bit more about my inner experience. It's very hard to really, one can comprehend the discomfort, but it's still a comprehension. It's still a conceptualization. It's not the experience. And so getting that across so that it lands in a way that makes sense to him was challenging, but he's a very patient person. So that made that possible.
And you were also willing to put in the effort, to put in the labor of explaining it in such a way that it would land on him, rather than falling into your own frustration, which would have been, I guess, reasonable enough under the circumstances. But the impact of that then on the relationship could have been negative, even though your frustration, your disappointment, your anger, and all of that stuff is valid, for valid reason. When that starts to become corrosive around the relationship. So regardless of his individual experience too, the shared third thing created between you still needs to be taken care of, and that you were willing, despite your own discomforts, to continue to take care of him and take care of the relationship, because it matters.
Well, yes, and I think
you don't just get to check out because you've got cancer. Like, you still need to participate.
In other words, I would say this. I've been saying this for years, even prior to my own diagnosis. When one member of a relationship is sick, that sickness now belongs to the realm of the relationship.
Right. Yeah.
And because of membership. So it's not just about my cancer diagnosis or my cancer treatment or my inability to perform sexually or engage sexually the way I used to, right? It's about tending to the immateriality of a shared relational space. And I am a big fan, and what I say to clients all the time is that you can only be responsible for your knowability. Your knowability potentiates relatability. Potentiates. It doesn't promise, but it potentiates, right? And so if I can share my experience, right, he at least has an opportunity to go, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? He can, right? He's not in my body. He can't know what my experience is, but I can share that experience with him. And if he has any empathy, he's able to understand that, appreciate that, at least conceptually, and we can adjust and adapt to that, which is really what we wound up doing. There wasn't a lot of conflict. I'm trying to think of what the big challenges were. There wasn't a lot of conflict about this. Now, I know for some people that is not the case.
No, and I think that that's what makes your situation, distinct, is because you are both very advanced communicators. And that helps.
It's very hard. We don't sit around chatting about our relationship that much.
No, but I don't even mean communication is so much more than
yes.
Speech. Communication is listening. Communication is compromise. Communication is making space for complexity and texture. It's not just, I'm going to sit here and ask you a bunch of interview questions. That's a kind of communication, but it's in a situation like this, where we have to alter the way we connect. That's a long game, and that's going to involve so much more than just speech. It has to be you communicate with so many parts of yourself, including your facial gestures, all that stuff. And but all of it requires energy. All of it requires attention. All of it requires presence. And when we check out of ourselves and relationships, and we don't bother putting in the effort to show up energetically, that's when everything turns to shit.
Agreed. In other words, that requires that the relationship matters, the other person who is participating it matters, and that there is really not only explicit valuing of that, but implicit valuing of that. So that, like I said, this is a shared experience. So there's no way, and like you said, communication is so much more than speech. That's right. We communicate a lot, not necessarily by talking. And that often surprises people, right? Because here we are in the world of therapy, which is bound in language.
Right. But that's what I mean about you two being advanced communicators, because I see the way you interact with each other. I obviously have that more intimate view than an outsider would. But I see the way you two communicate with each other. And I also see the subtleties of the communication, that it's not just like, what would you like for dinner, darling? I would like, potatoes. Like, I know it's far more, truncated and visceral than that.
Yes,
so,
right.
And, yes, for communication 101, it has to be speech. But when we're talking about communication 501, it almost becomes intuitive, but you notice it when it's not there. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle with, is when it's not there, then they shut down. And then that's when they'll end up coming to couples counseling. And often then it's too late, because it has become so corrosive that it's game over already.
Corrosive, and also I find with some clients, they're so apprehensive about being hurt or hurting the other that they really kind of crippled themselves. But you're right? There is a lot of, I believe, and you've heard me say this, we're always communicating, whether we like it or not, right? And so with everything that we do, we're always communicating. And so, no, it's been a process, and it's been, it's been, a dear friend of mine once said, especially around this myopic view of the penis, right? There are other toys on the playground. There's a lot of pleasure in this house, from your standpoint.
Right. And that's the thing about, being able to decenter the dick. And this would be true in gay contexts and other, contexts where dicks tend to get centered. Not necessarily because anybody wants it that way. It just sort of defaults to that. And that when we can stop and sort of step back and think, well, why do we always default to sex being dick-centric when there are dicks involved? When it doesn't really have to be. When I do ask clients about that in my work, why are we defaulting to dick-centric sex? And it will always be like, I don't know. Why do we do that? Which is a good place to be curious from, is to
Agreed.
To allow ourselves to go, well, we don't have to do it this way just because it was spoon-fed to us that this is how sex is supposed to look.
I agree with that very strongly for men, cisgendered men, and then for many gay men who are cisgendered as well. The sexual menu is small. And it also, for cisgendered men, and I would say for a lot of gay men, the semiotic aspect of a penis in our sociocultural context is one of, that stands for masculinity, that stands for power, that stands for, right?
And then when it doesn't stand, the implication is it's the opposite. Or it's not even the opposite, because I guess the opposite technically would be it's feminine, but it's not even feminine. It's just nothing. It becomes nothing, which is perhaps worse than being feminine, apparently. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being feminine.
A lot of the writers around this would talk about the feminization of the body. In other words, that it's not responding the same way it did prior to prostate surgery. I don't feel,
but it's not really feminized. I mean that I guess that's
the orgasm. I would say that the orgasm is not the same. It's not the same as it was, in the sense of its locality is much more expanded than it was when all the nerves were functioning in my penis. So it's not as localized. It's more what some of the more tantric people would call full body orgasm.
And that, I mean, the research would support that also. What I understand about how brain research has been done around orgasm generally, that, regardless of one's genitalia, people who tend to practice Tantra and things of that caliber, they have noticed different brain activity for that kind of orgasmic structure. And so regardless of what is happening to you with your genitals, even if you have had other kinds of, genital surgeries that have altered your capacity for conventional orgasm, there is data now that shows the brain's capacity to reroute and rewire toward pleasure, including people who allegedly have orgasms in their toes and in their thumbs and in their elbows and things, because the wires will, pleasure will always exist as long as we create context for it.
Agreed. And I think it's really, for me, I mean, for other people, and I've worked with other people around this where, men are more concerned and they'll, think about penile implants and things like that. And it works well enough. It's sufficient. That's a very extreme, yet another surgery. And so that would not, I don't know if that would ever be something I would do if I was single. In other words, it certainly hasn't dulled my aggressive energies at all. That's more of a function of both testosterone and psychology and personality. I don't have a feminized experience that I could kind of point at or cling to in any kind of way.
Right. And I mean, I think, I don't know where that sort of language would fit in, but it's also curious to me that, the absence of an erection therefore means, it's feminized or it's bereft of masculinity, which is very much a cultural script. And, again, if we look at it through a gender affirming lens, regardless of whether we are cisgender or otherwise, gender affirming practices are important to lots of different people. And so for cisgender men who are experiencing erection issues as a result of cancer or as a result of other
this can
conditions,
take them down the deep end very quickly.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
And so the point being, the reason I invited you back is because I wanted to initiate a discussion about this, because I don't hear a lot of personal anecdotal stories about this. There's the clinical data, which obviously matters to a point, but for the cisgendered men who are living with this, these conversations are profoundly powerful. And as you said, women have been talking about breast cancer since forever. And increasingly, there needs to be more visibility of cisgendered men talking about their relationships with their penises in ways that are really helpful to other dudes. So I appreciate your time, Eric, and I appreciate your willingness. I don't want to say the V word because maybe it wasn't vulnerable for you, but I appreciate your attention regardless.
No, I think I agree with you. I think this is a very important topic for a lot of men, and a lot of men who are sort of penis-centric in their attitudes about sex. Cisgendered heterosexual men assume that, all women want to be fucked and that's, what they desire. And, we know that that's not necessarily the truth, that there aren't enough good conversations happening around sex, sexual desire, sexual menus, sexual appetites. And that, as a body ages and changes, levels of desire change, what was once pleasurable may change, and sort of the evolving sexual landscape is also, part of that conversation. And unfortunately, no, many men are, even gay men, as much as gay men seem, as a subculture within the world, a lot of sort of sexualization has been placed upon us as the repository, if you will, for sex and all that kind of stuff. That's changing, of course. It's becoming more across the board. But at the same time, even within gay male relationships, it's not like, we're having these stellar conversations about sex and being what I would say, and when I talk about your book, I talk about it as there's a way of making sex a more intimate aspect of your relational life. And that means, how you are relating to your sexuality, what sex means to you, how it gets the evaluation process, all of it that's sort of under the covers. When we start making that more explicit, we're actually engaging in a more intimate relationship with ourselves and potentially with those that we love and care about. But it's a tough one. It can really be tough for some people. The absence of ejaculation can be very painful for some people. For me, meant less cleanup.
Right. I guess that's the upside.
As a hairy guy, it means less cleanup, right? So.
Eric, it's lovely to catch up with you. Thank you so much. And thank you on behalf of the audience of The Erotic Philosopher. Thank you for your willingness and your tenderness with this story.
My pleasure.